VWBT is proud to present the show that squashes reality like a bug. That's right, you better be ready to MegaRace!
It's time to select your MegaRace machine enforcer. Look at those beauties. Go ahead, help yourself.
Today for ADG Pro, we're going to go back to one of my favorite DOS FMV games, MegaRace, and answer a question I've had ever since I started playing this back in the 90s. Does it even matter what car you pick? I mean, given the FMV nature of the game, it would almost seem as though there's very little you could actually vary while still making the experience make sense. Except, no, it turns out there are stats for each individual car, and they matter more than you might expect. In fact, I uncovered a bunch of details I didn't know about the game during my testing here, and also came to some interesting conclusions given what I discovered. So let's dive in and try to figure out everything that's going on here. Now, before we can even begin to test all the vehicles, we need to acquire them. The game only starts you with 3 of the 8 cars by default, and you have to play through the first 5 quote-unquote races to earn the other 5 before you can choose between all 8. But I took the opportunity at the start to do some preliminary testing to figure a few things out. Specifically, the scoring. Up in the top right is a score counter which shows you your current total score throughout the course of the game. Also, as you complete quote-unquote races, you sometimes earn prizes, which are simply different FMV sequences to watch, and it'll either be a regular quality prize or a high quality prize. Well, I wanted to figure out what triggered these different prizes, and it turns out the only thing that matters is the score. In fact, you need to rack up exactly 8,000 points minimum in a single race to get a normal quality prize, and 12,000 points for a high quality prize. Now, the reason I keep calling them quote-unquote races is because despite the title, MegaRace is not really a racing game, and this is made extremely apparent from the kinds of testing I was doing. Now, enemy vehicles are only allowed to get a certain distance out in front of you and only up to a certain distance behind you, nor can you face more than a single vehicle at a time. Plus, if they stay behind you for a particular amount of time, they'll begin to rapidly take damage and get destroyed. Now, some of the testing I did later showed that the more damaged an opponent was, the less time they had to stay behind you to be destroyed, but the difference was very small. Anyways, once I had all 8 cars unlocked, it was time to start the real testing. So one of the fun things you can do when selecting a car is press the spacebar or escape key instead of enter. What this does is pull up a little animation of the car forming, followed by providing some stats along the side of the screen. But what do some of these stats even mean? Weight values? High beam reactors? Do any of these values mean anything? Well, let's find out. First thing I tested was the armor. There's 4 different armor ratings: light, medium, strong, and heavy, with no indication as to just how good any of those actually are. So, I took each vehicle out for a spin and measured the number of frames it took while grinding against the sidewall at top speed, which is the same for every vehicle by the way, to run out of armor and get destroyed. The results were revealing. I rounded the results to make better sense of them, and because this wasn't too exact of a science. But generally speaking, light armor is equal to 1,200 points, medium is equal to 1,600 points, strong is equal to 1,800 points, and heavy is equal to 2,000 points. However, there are 2 exceptions. The Paloma vehicle is rated as heavily armored, yet it has stronger armor than the other heavily armored vehicle, with roughly 2,200 points. So, given that heavy is the highest value, it makes sense. But what makes no sense is the Ozbol. You start the game with this car and it's supposed to be strongly armored, but testing showed it only rated at 1,200 armor points, the same as a lightly armored vehicle. So right off the bat, we're seeing inconsistencies with the vehicle stats. This means we can't take anything for granted and have to test literally everything, even the details which seem like they should be dead obvious, like gun quantities and the presences of warning devices, shields, and missiles. I also did some testing to see if the weight values or engine type made any sort of sense, and tried some things related to that, such as checking how quickly vehicles could accelerate to max speed, and if there were differences in terms of catching up to opponents or overtaking them, or even if there were damage differences from ramming opponents. But no, short of a bug which sometimes occurs at the start of a race and completely breaks the way cars catch up to you, there's no differences with any of these things. Thus the engine type and weight values are useless. Or are they? I also felt it'd be a good idea to test the guns and see if certain vehicles had stronger guns than the others, and it turns out, yeah, every vehicle does a different amount of damage with their guns. But before I could figure out the exact values, I had to figure out how many shots it was taking. The Oze is the weakest guns of all, requiring 12 shots most of the time, though sometimes 13, to take out an opponent. The Hooper, Louis, and Omega all require 10 shots. The Maria and Paloma need 7 shots, while the Ozbol and Ramon only require 5 shots to take out opponents, though sometimes 6. After a bit of testing, I really wasn't able to gauge why certain cars fluctuated in terms of how much damage their guns were doing. It could be that there's a slight bit of randomness, but I think the answer might simply be floating point rounding errors. Although another interesting factor is that every time you fire your guns, you're actually firing multiple shots in extremely rapid succession. Thus, depending on how everything's moving, there's a very small chance that only some of those shots will hit, while the others miss, reducing your damage potential. But most of the time, all of the shots will hit. I also decided to figure out how much energy every vehicle had for firing their guns, and this is when I noticed something very curious. The amount of shots each vehicle could take before running out of energy directly corresponded to how much damage the guns were doing. But as you can see from these numbers on screen now, it wasn't a clear-cut distinction. Now, I checked frame by frame and noticed that the math wasn't 100% spot on, except for the 10-shot vehicles, which always seemed to go down at the very end of a 10th shot, rather than during it. So needing 10 shots and having 80 shots worth of energy seemed to be the baseline. There were a couple other things I noticed too, such as how there was no upper cap on energy levels. Now, even though the energy gauge has a maximum limit on it, your stored energy can far exceed that limit. In fact, if there is a hard limit, it's gotta be really high up there. The other pertinent detail has to do with running over the appropriate track symbol to trigger dual or triple firing guns. Now, I always just assumed more guns equals more damage, especially since they burn more energy, but nope. More guns does the same amount of damage as just a single gun, but at a higher energy cost. This might just be a bug, but I have a funny feeling it's part of a bigger picture that I'm going to comment on in a bit. Measuring damage for missiles is also kind of useless. Now, the missiles work just like the guns, but immediately take out an opponent in a single shot. Plus, only 2 vehicles are supposedly capable of equipping them, the Ozbol and Raymond. And sure enough, those are the only 2 I could get the missiles working on. Though ironically, every vehicle has the ability to show the presence of missiles or extra guns, even if they can't equip them. Which you can see happening if you switch from a car that ended a race using missiles to a car which can't equip them, as it won't switch them off until you go to attack. Again, something I intend to get into a little later. Though to answer the original question of if any of this ties in with the reactor and weight ratings, they do not. So yeah, weight and reactor ratings are 100% useless confirmed. Let's check out the warning systems next. Now, certain tracks have the ability to turn on a warning system for the remainder of the track on cars which support the feature, allowing you to see a visualization of some of the symbols coming up before they reach you. It's not really that useful because of how little time you get to react to them. It's still a neat feature. You can toggle this on and off with the tab key once it's acquired, though again, it only lasts for the current level, so once the level's done, warning system goes away. But yeah, the Oze can equip one, the Hooper can't, the Louis can, the Ozbol can, the Maria freaking can, despite the stats saying it can't, the Paloma can't, the Omega can, and the Ramon can't. But yeah, that's 2 discrepancies now. We're gonna find any more? Well, how about 8 more? This leads into the last thing I checked, which was the shield system. Now, supposedly, the Oze, Louis, Ozbol, and Omega can have a shield system toggled which protects you from enemies, but just take a guess which of these cars had shields and which didn't. If you guessed none of them have shields, then you're right. So yeah, every vehicle even has an indicator in it to indicate shield activity, but this never lights up after running over a shield symbol on the track, which makes noise, so you're absolutely hitting it. And none of the keys on the keyboard do anything to toggle such a system following. This kind of ties into a vibe I was getting this entire time, in that I think the devs at Cryo Interactive wanted to make this game more than it ended up being. I think they did want it to play like a real racing game with extra features and everything, but ultimately settled on this simpler arcade-style format, either because of time, budget, technical limitations, or whatever. But just as another example of this, the enemy cars can technically shoot at you, but the range is so tiny that it's almost impossible to see this happening, since they have to be behind you and at the perfect range. And I've seen it happen more than once though, so I know it absolutely can. Ultimately, the information I figured out is listed on screen right now, along with some rough estimates on some of the math involved, and I've got a PDF linked in the video description if you want something in reference when you're playing the game. But there are two last things to comment on. The first is that the only way you get points in this game is by directly destroying an enemy vehicle, by running over the appropriate symbols on the track, or by shooting a target. You get 50 points for every successful shot against an enemy vehicle, which means to get the most points in any race, you have to do all of your damage with guns. But remember, every vehicle does differing amounts of damage with their guns, so you also need to be driving the Jose vehicle to maximize your scoring. Which is fine too, because it's the only vehicle with a maximum laser gun count of 1, meaning you won't be wasting energy switching into the double or triple gun modes. And the one final thing I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what the heck is the throtlometer good for? Well, after extensive testing and checking to see what things it related to in terms of in-game logic, I'll tell you. Absolutely freaking nothing. It rises when you damage or destroy an opponent, and drops slowly over time or faster when you take damage yourself, and other than that, has no effect whatsoever on anything. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of ADG Pro. I was kind of hoping these MegaRace stats would be a bit more revealing, but as it turned out, there's a lot more going on under the hood than we realized. Also a little less even, with the shields being completely omitted from the formula. I even noticed a lot of the music goes for a lot longer than a typical race even lasts, and sounds better when you ramp up DOSBox's audio emulation of the OPL to its highest recommended frequency. But in any case, next week for ADG Mod, we're going to explore what kind of shenanigans we can get into by manipulating some level data manually, despite the game we intend to mess with having a built-in editor. So be sure to stay tuned and see what kinds of crazy things we can accomplish. Thanks for watching everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.